All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Laura Polvinen. I am your host tonight with Christine Vanderwerf. I will introduce her in just a moment. I'm the Director of Counseling and Community Engagement at Landmark, and we are so excited to have you here for the first of our four-part Landmark Learn webinar series on social emotional learning. Tonight, we're going to kick it off with an overview of social emotional learning. While everyone is joining, I'm going to go through some housekeeping so we're all on the same page. Feel free at any point tonight to enter your questions into the chat or the Q&A, and Christine will be able to answer them as we go along. So just so you know, we also have some other upcoming webinars. As I said, this is the first in the four-part series. The next one will be February 25th, and that will focus specifically on the SEL areas of self-awareness and self-management with two other wonderful professionals from Landmark. And then again in March, we'll be exploring relationship skills and social awareness. And finally, following it up in April with responsible decision making. So that hits on all of the different CASEL competencies that Christine will be discussing tonight. You can utilize this QR code here if you'd like to sign up to attend either at the time that the webinar is happening or to receive the recording afterward. Just some logistics. After tonight, we'll be sending a recording and some resources from this webinar, as well as the slides that Christine put together in the next few days. Again, you can use the Q&A button or the chat at any point in time, and we will answer your questions as we go through the presentation. Finally, you can turn on closed captioning by clicking the CC or live transcript button that's typically at the bottom of your screen in your bar and choosing the show subtitle. Landmark Learns is brought to you by Landmark School. For those of you who don't know us well, we serve students in grades 2 through 12 with dyslexia and related language-based learning disorders on two different campuses that are both 30 miles north of Boston. We have an elementary middle school campus where I'm located and a high school campus where Christine is. Landmark is best known for our highly individualized program for every student in every class with every teacher every day. And here you might enjoy some of the highlights, some of our favorite moments with our teachers and students. Finally, while Landmark School serves students and families, our outreach program provides educators with online professional development courses, school partnerships, publications, and in-person summer institute, and more. You can check out our website for more information about those programs, including upcoming webinars through outreach, as well as that summer institute. All right, Christine, are you ready? To kick off an evening of social emotional wellness? What could be better at a time right now? January, dark, cold. I think this is what we all need. So I'd like to introduce Christine. Christine is a licensed independent clinical social worker who's been at Landmark for over a decade. She is a high school counselor. She's also the DEIB committee participant and the leader of our GSA faculty. This is a picture of us from when we were much younger and well-rested about a decade ago. Things have happened. A lot of things have happened since then. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Christine.
Of course. Thanks for having me, and thank you all for joining tonight. I have had the real privilege of working with Laura for over a decade now, and it is funny to look back on how well-rested we were 10 years ago.
That's right. All right, well, let's jump right in.
All right, so our objective for tonight is to define and understand social emotional learning. We'll refer to it as SEL throughout this presentation. You might hear that in other places, as well as its 5 core competencies. We have an agenda tonight, and the sole purpose of this was to give an example of, as a tool for forecasting, which supports a person's self-awareness and self-management, which are some of the skills and the competencies we'll discuss later. So we are going to talk about the 5 pillars of SEL. What does this look like at home versus school? So what can we do? And then questions, and we'll wrap it up.
So Christine, you said forecasting. Would this be like a tool to use at home, an agenda, or what do you mean by forecasting? Like how would a typical person in an average day use that skill?
Yeah, so we don't typically use an agenda at home, but I think with many children, including my own, I like to preview what's to come. It helps our anxious individuals and younger folks and folks with skill development kind of learn to come what's next or see what's coming next so they can kind of assume and make adjustments accordingly.
That's great. Thanks.
So, social emotional learning is a strengths-based approach that helps people develop skills to support healthy relationships. We're going to be using the CASEL framework. The CASEL stands for Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. At the center, so in the orange, green, and yellow areas, are the five core competencies, and they are self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, social awareness, and relationship skills. We will be talking about each of these competencies later. And surrounding the competencies are the four primary settings where students live and grow, which include communities, families, and caregivers, schools, and classrooms. The partnership between the four settings informs SEL practices and establishes equitable learning environments across all of these contexts.
So Christine, you and I have looked at this image a lot over time, but it can be kind of a jumble to take in. So it sounds like for tonight, we're mostly going to be focused on those pie pieces in the middle, but
Yes,
understanding that kind of all of the aspects of a child's life are impacted or connected to social emotional learning.
absolutely.
So why should we care about SEL? Why? I mean, hopefully folks are interested in the topic or at least have heard the buzzword. And I know you and I are passionate about it in our work and our personal lives, but why care? Like what's the underlying importance of something like social emotional learning?
It's a great question. I think it's been such a buzzword and buzz topic. Some of the research shows that SEL can improve academic performance, improve social emotional functioning, improve student-teacher relationships, and child and parent relationships, result in better indicators of adult happiness and life satisfaction, build independence and empowerment for young people, and it's the foundation for metacognition, which is the awareness or analysis of one's own learning or thinking process.
So the shorter list might be why not care about SEL,
Yeah,
which it sounds like it touches all of the important aspects that we want for our children as they grow.
absolutely.
So we all want our kids to become successful and adults, and a huge piece of that is them learning independence and learning and growing into themselves. And social emotional learning is really at the crux of that in so many ways. And I'm excited tonight, Christine, for you to tell us a little bit more about what's happening at school, but also the ways that we can foster social emotional learning at home, because I know that our students and our children are learning from us constantly, whether we're attentive to it or not, and that all learning is valuable in many ways for our students and our children, even when we don't think that the things we're doing are important.
Yes.
So first, let's start with self-awareness. This is, if I had to pick a favorite, this one might be it.
So, as you can see on your screen, self-awareness is an individual's ability to understand their own emotions, thoughts, beliefs, actions, and values, and how they influence behavior. So, if you've ever heard of CBT, it kind of lines up with that. This includes the capacity to recognize one's strengths and limitations with a well-grounded sense of confidence and purpose. Teaching self-awareness involves explicit education around emotion identification. It can involve the use of strategies like emotion check-ins, mindfulness strategies, that kind of thing. An individual cannot have metacognition, as we mentioned before, if they do not have self-awareness.
Can I ask a question about, like, at what age would you expect students to start to be building self-awareness? Like, is this something that you would find true for toddlers, you think, or?
I think I think of my own toddler, and I think that we are definitely infusing some of these skills at the age of almost 3. She thinks she's 10, and kind of building those skills. But I think that this is a skill set that emerges and grows and develops over time.
And is this something that once students hit a point that they're developing self-awareness, it's kind of like a checkbox, or we kind of keep growing and evolving in that space? I think a lot of times our students want to learn a skill and master it. And what might that look like?
From my perspective, this is a lifelong learning process. I think that as much as also adults would like to be able to check that box, I think it's a skill that we can all develop and enhance over time.
I think too about how it must change depending on where we are. If we're put in new situations, it's going to require us to be self-aware to develop that differently than we might have in a place that we're really comfortable. So I think about so many of our students when they transition to our school, that self-awareness is going to build differently than maybe in the home setting they've been so familiar with.
Absolutely.
So can you give us some examples of what like a student with developing self-awareness looks like in a school setting?
Yeah, so at school, this can look like a student presenting as overwhelmed and shut down, and then the student being prompted to use adult resources. While this skill set is developing, this can be something that can be prompted by an adult. So we at school, at the high school, often will have students building this skill present as withdrawn, overwhelmed, demonstrating anxious symptoms, and an adult, either a teacher or another trusted adult, might prompt them to utilize additional supports, including a counselor or an advisor.
It sounds like there might be many situations where even students who have a greater self-awareness might need kind of adult support at times when maybe they're experiencing something new or nuanced, or just like having a harder day. Maybe they're having trouble advocating for what they need.
Absolutely.
I was thinking too about how sometimes at school that there might be kids who are sitting, I'm looking at this child here crying or upset, and that it's okay sometimes to let them struggle before swooping in. What do you think about that? Like, how do you know? How do you know when to let students kind of sit in that self-awareness place versus offering them that support in the moment?
I think that it is absolutely appropriate to allow a child or a student sit in some discomfort. I think that's where skill building opportunities arise. I think as a parent, I think I've put on my parenting hat, my social worker hat, and those can be different things or feel a little different. It is really hard to watch our own children or other children kind of present as if they are struggling. But I think that is an opportunity for growth. But I think too, having especially at the beginning stages of developing self-awareness, they may need more adult supervision and redirection.
That makes sense. Okay, so at school, we might have the privilege of being able to send a student to a counselor, extra support. I know in my home, even though I am a counselor, I need a lifeline sometimes. So, what does this look like at home?
So what you might see at home can look like anger. Um, And it's funny because Laura and I were talking about meeting our own basic human needs earlier today, and you can interrupt that anger almost with providing a snack. So I kind of think of hangry. One of my two children is definitely the hangrier of the two, and has now begun to advocate for a snack, which I think is great progress. But you can kind of interrupt, and you might have to be the adult intervening in that moment.
I think this image speaks to me in particular. I definitely need to have a snack bag with me. And I feel like maybe some of my colleagues too benefit from the understanding of, like me, having someone hand me a snack when they can tell maybe it's been a long morning.
Absolutely.
So it sounds like when students are developing self-awareness, we're trying to get them to connect that, like, what are they feeling? Or I think you said before, like labeling a feeling to even
Mhm.
know. And I know with our elementary students in particular, and definitely middle, we're trying to have students move past just like happy, sad, mad to kind of some of the more nuanced. What are some of the, I love this image, but what are some of the feelings that you talk about more with your high schoolers? Like, how do you get into that nuance with maybe a middle or a high school population?
That's a great question. I think that a lot of the students that I work with, and being in my 10th school year here, it's interesting because I think there's an assumption that all folks will have a more developed understanding of emotions. I think a lot of times we still start with happy, sad, angry. I have a lot of, I would say, upperclassmen at this point labeling higher level emotions. So I think anxiety comes up a lot. I think it is a challenging time for many students, and I have about a dozen seniors that I'm working with. So there's a lot of anxiety there about upcoming transitions mixed with that excitement. So I think it's an ongoing developing skill, especially for our students who have more significant language needs and need to focus on that like language skill development as well.
So it sounds like, especially as we get students to label their own feelings, just using that language with them or helping them kind of dissect, like, are you more than just angry? Maybe you're hangry,
Mhm.
or maybe you're sad because you feel embarrassed about something that happened, kind of helping them label the feeling so they know. And then that can kind of move them to the needs piece.
Mhm.
I like this breakdown of Maslow's hierarchy of needs of, we all
Yeah.
need that food, water, shelter piece, sleep, which feels
Mhm.
fleeting at this point in life, but how do we help our students move kind of from knowing what they're feeling to what they need? Like what might that start to look like?
I think that's exactly what we're talking about. So I think being able to work through that emotion identification piece, and we talk about how I talk about with my students a lot. It's the emotion identification, the expression, and then the regulation piece. So it's kind of a package deal. Um, and recognizing what I need is kind of trying out different things and different strategies. Not all strategies will work for all people. So I think that there's a number of opportunities for skill development to kind of move towards recognizing that piece of what you need.
Yeah, so that crux is kind of the self-awareness piece. I know we say in counseling all the time, kids come to school and they bring their feelings, right? So
Yep.
there's not really any situation that we are in as humans where there might not be some sort of a feeling. And it sounds like the first step is really kind of knowing that to be able to move through whatever it is you have to do next.
Absolutely.
So as kids are building, their self-awareness and maybe starting to utilize some of that self-management, like what does that look like at school?
A student with this picture that is utilizing self-awareness can kind of recognize that feeling of feeling distracted or having difficulty focusing in general and utilize a strategy like chewing a piece of gum to reset and refocus. They would almost unprompted in that moment be able to utilize that skill, where before, when we were developing that skill set, it could be a prompted strategy by another person.
And what about at home?
At home, I feel like the opportunity for access to strategies is really diverse in a different setting. So at home, it can look like a student recognizing feelings of overwhelm. Maybe they're sitting down to do their work, and then they can reset by taking a shower, either hot or cold, to kind of re-regulate and re-engage with the task afterwards.
I feel like this is so valuable to think about not only for students, but for ourselves as grown-ups. Like, how do we regulate? Obviously, if you're in the middle of your workday as an adult, you don't have necessarily the ability to go take a shower, but a walk, a piece of gum, a
Yep,
cold drink or something. And at home, yeah, something, nothing, sometimes nothing hits like a nice shower when you've had a
yep,
long day.
absolutely.
All right, so we've covered self-awareness. Now let's move into self-management, that kind of next little piece of our pie.
Great. Self-management is the ability to manage one's emotions, thoughts, and behaviors effectively in different situations and to achieve goals. This includes the capacity to manage stress, delay gratification, and to feel motivation and agency to complete goals. Regulation, which is the ability to exert control over one's own physical and emotional state, is a huge component of self-management. Regulation is a skill that must be taught. I think we, as adults, forget learning to regulate, and it's an ongoing process, like we talked about before. Um, and it's something that will kind of, or Laura and I have talked about how regulation kind of is the backbone of a lot of these strategies and skills that we'll talk about today.
Something I was thinking about is just working with a student population in terms of self-management, how the self-awareness piece is so crucial, but moving to self-management can feel like such a big step sometimes.
Yes.
And that students can be really hard on themselves when they're having a hard time regulating, which is essentially so difficult when your frontal lobe, like that wise, logical mind, isn't necessarily on board.
Mhm.
Um, how do you talk to students about like their brain growing and developing or adolescence when you're flooded with emotions and how that might impact self-management or what they can do?
A big step for me is kind of normalizing that experience because I think it can feel really isolating as a person who's struggling to regulate. I think there's a perception, especially with adolescents, especially at the high school level, of perceiving your peers as being really regulated, engaged, productive, and positive people, without recognizing that all folks are kind of managing that piece. We talk about emotion flooding, that overwhelmed feeling. I think too, it ties back a little bit to self-awareness. We have some really great tools called emotion wheels, where students can use a tangible resource to kind of help with that identification piece. So I think the foundation of self-management is building on the backbone of that self-awareness piece.
Mm. And it sounds like we'll get into social awareness in a little bit, but our self-management is often inherently connected to our social awareness or our stress from how we think others perceive us, or even, with elementary, middle schoolers, and I'm sure high schoolers too, we're wanting kids to regulate, but also be aware of how others' regulation affects our own. It's really hard to stay regulated when everyone else is stressed. Like I think about
Yeah.
walking into, I know we're going to talk about a test in just a moment, that you walk into a test and you're feeling confident and everyone else is stressed or having negative self-talk, like we're going to fail, this is going to be the hardest ever. It's pretty hard to stay regulated and keep your cool in the moment.
Absolutely.
So in action, what does this look like at school? Like what can the actual management of an unpleasant feeling look like?
Uh, a lot of times what we talk about, as you mentioned, is test taking, especially at the high school level. There's a lot of anxiety for our students around tests. So self-management at school can look like a student knowing or anticipating stress around taking a test. They experience a little bit of that stress, kind of feel it in their body and recognize that they're experiencing that, and then taking deep breaths or utilizing a different strategy to help themselves regulate and reset.
What do you feel like most students at the high school that you work with use? Like, what do they find helpful in moments of stress, whether it's a test or something else? Like, what are they turning to? Is it the new fidget spinner? What is it these days?
Neato is the top fidget, I think. So we have a lot of students who will utilize a physical fidget, and then various breathing strategies. So I think for some students, square breathing is a really great intervention. I think two or three big deep breaths is really helpful. I had a student to me today demonstrate their version of deep breathing, and it was just hyperventilation. So we worked on reframing what deep breathing looks like. But I would say that though the breathing strategies and the use of a fidget, because I think they feel more manageable in an academic setting, are probably the most common for the students that I'm working with.
I think sometimes students want to feel like they're doing something, like there's this
Yes.
piece of what's a strategy I can use that's actually, if I'm working on self management, even though I know students aren't thinking to themselves, like, how do I manage myself in this
Mm.
moment? Doing something feels different than not. Can you
Yes,
tell us a little bit about how, like, what square breathing is? What does that look like, or what do you do?
sure. So I'll show in the air, but usually what I will prompt some students to do because they like the sensory feedback is you draw a square. So you would breathe in for 3 breaths on the way up and breathe out for 3 breaths on the way. Breathe in as you go down for 3 seconds, and then breathe out again for 3 seconds. A lot of students will do it on their leg so they feel the feedback. And I think a lot of students have shared that they enjoy strategies like that because it's something that they feel like no one might notice. I feel
Hmm.
like it's a hot topic, is not having peers or adults notice that you're having a hard time. And it's a strategy you can use anywhere. I feel like being able to breathe is a natural human response, and it's something that we have control over, even if when we feel like we're out of control.
Absolutely. And for middle schoolers, no middle schooler wants to be different. To like, you're not going to sit and draw a square probably in the middle of class.
Yep.
You could definitely do it on your leg without noticing, which is a great strategy.
Yeah.
What about at home? I mean, I know that obviously families can practice breathing strategies at home, which is really helpful, but I know sometimes outside of school, kids can be a little more resistant. Like, what might that use of self-management look like at home after students are aware of what they need or what's going on?
Yeah. I think you can tell that I was probably hungry when making some of these slides. So at home, that can look like knowing that you have a hefty plate of homework for the evening and anticipating that it might take a longer period of time and that you're feeling a little unfocused, that having a snack and kind of meeting those basic human physiological needs, like we referenced in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, will allow you the opportunity to access and engage in the academic piece, which might not be the highlight of the afternoon.
Mm. I love how students often know what they need, and sometimes are figuring out how to communicate it. I definitely think we have students who go home and need to do their homework right away just to be done. But if they're not fed or in a place where they have the fuel, and then other students who are happy, they need to wait. They're like, I just was in school, I can't do homework right away. So it's cool when they can think about the why besides just maybe picking because they don't want to do it right away.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about mindfulness, because I think that is kind of the backbone, after you've moved from a place of self-awareness to self-management, that regulation piece, that mindfulness is kind of the crux of self-regulation for all of us.
Definitely. So mindfulness means maintaining a moment by moment awareness of our thoughts, feelings, bodily sensations, and external environment, which is a lot to keep track of, through a nurturing lens. A goal would be to kind of make it part of your routine. I think mindfulness can feel like this really big, overwhelming topic. And if you break it down, it can be something that's quite manageable. A person cannot self-manage unless they're being mindful. It's worth noting that not all tools work for all people, so there's a little bit of trial and error that goes along with this process. And some examples, and they kind of range, include 1 to 2 minutes of stillness. That's something Laura and I have talked about that I kind of love the idea. It's not often that we are sitting still, or I know I'm not sitting still that often, so it's a nice reminder of being in touch with your bodily sensations. 3 deep breaths. Yoga is a great strategy. There's chair yoga, so it's something that you can sit in a chair in a classroom or at home and utilize also. Physical exercise is a great option for mindfulness, getting in touch with your body. Temperature change, we mentioned like taking the shower hot or cold, so you can take a hot shower or drink some really cold water. So I think that's a really good reset tool, especially in an academic setting. And then using apps like Calm, the Insight Timer, and Headspace are all really great reminders. And then once mindful, you can advance to the other skills and competencies that we will speak about next.
So I think you're describing mindfulness a little bit like just being in the moment. So it doesn't necessarily require, like sitting and meditating for a period of time, but just grounding yourself so you're not. I know we can all hit those moments where you have a little bit of like an anxiety spiral or a little bit of reflective over analysis of maybe something that happened, but instead kind of choosing the present moment. Um, I think mindfulness can sometimes be a daunting word. Even as a counselor, I feel like this pressure, I
Mhm.
should be meditating every day to be mindful, but it sounds like there are ways to be in the moment or put yourself in the moment, whether it's just like taking that sip of water. Um, what do you as an adult use when you're trying to be mindful amidst like caring for students all day long? Because I imagine there's a number of parents who are balancing that all day long, caring for our children. And it's hard to stay mindful when you have all the things, the mental load, everything happening in your orbit at once.
It is a lot. I think we are all managing a lot. I would say that my initial response is to say I'm not great at practicing mindfulness. It's an ongoing process for me. I think I am a big fan of the cold sip of water. I think not only am I challenging myself to drink more water throughout the day, but that cold reset is really helpful. And I find myself, if I have gaps of time, listening to some music that I really find enjoyable or relaxing and just taking that moment to reset and refocus.
That makes a lot of sense. I think sometimes about how um, a good kind of gauge on mindfulness is if you can kind of forget on everything else for the moment, like if you're just so tuned into something. And for some of our students, it's humor, I've noticed, really helps kids be in the
Yeah,
moment. And so if that's playing a game or being playful or having a joke or something like that, that can kind of take away the intensity of a feeling that someone or adults might have too, and being able to then move through and manage whatever that situation is.
definitely.
All right, so now we're moving on to social awareness. So we have this kind of foundation where a big chunk of social emotional learning is for us to know what's happening and to be able to identify like a feeling or be self-aware within ourselves of what we need, what's going on, and then to actually do the thing, like manage in that way. Um, and now we have social awareness. Can we talk a little bit about how that connects to these pieces?
Yes. Social awareness is the ability to take the perspective of and empathize with others, including those from diverse backgrounds and cultures. It includes displaying socially appropriate behaviors. Socially appropriate behaviors are dependent upon age, situation, skill level, and things to consider include neurodiversity and ableism. Those play a significant role in social awareness. Um, Situation specific is kind of like changing hats, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and about reading the room, which can be more difficult for some folks than others.
So it seems like it would be pretty hard to take a read on a social situation if you don't necessarily know what you're feeling in the moment. Or maybe you can still take a read on a situation, but you might not act in the way that you intended to if you're not aware of your own self in the moment.
Yes.
So, what is your suggestion for families who've got students who maybe are good identifiers of what they're feeling, but maybe that management part is hard, which means that it comes out in sometimes socially explosive ways or socially challenging ways, may be very shut down. Like what are some things families can do to kind of foster that understanding of how one might impact their family or a social dynamic?
I feel like this particular question hits home. I have a big feeling 6-year-old, so we have this conversation quite a bit. I think for me, focusing on that skill development piece, and I think the social awareness is that next step. Um, And it is having, like, discussing empathy and kind of the impact that you have in your behavior and decision making has on other folks. And I think too, like breaking it down step by step, because I think as a parent too, it can feel really daunting to focus on the social impacts that our child is having. And I think having consideration for how our own behavior impacts our social awareness and engagement with others is really important.
Absolutely. I think it's that piece where, we're talking about these categories in kind of a linear sense, but really they all go around this circle a little bit. So they're all intertwined at any point.
Yes. And as you mentioned before, it's not a checking of the box.
Right. So I know you picked out this video. Do you want to have us watch it first and then we can chat a little bit? Speaking of humor, hopefully this brings some humor to the perspective.
Sure.
Is that yours? Yeah, yours is over there. Oh, this is good coffee. Dude, it is so good. Dude, did you hear the Cubs won yesterday? Want to get some food? Yeah, man, let's do it. Cool. Oh, thanks, man. Yeah. Can I have something else? I have my birthday party coming up this weekend, but I'm not going to invite you. Oh, okay. Pepperoni sausage, black olives. Okay, hey, can you hold on a second? Yeah, I think my favorite is probably peach dish. Anyway, want to grab some coffee? Yeah, sure. Anyway, this coffee is amazing. Ooh, can I try some? No, this is not lunch, man. I got stuck though. Oh, awesome. How's your day going? Good, man. Yeah, I was just hanging out with the guys at the park. It's my turn to work home. Watch my Netflix? Yeah.
Obviously a nice dose of humor. So it's funny though, because in this video, obviously adults acting like our preschoolers might. The gentleman who's overreacting is technically self-managing. It's just impacting him, right? I mean, it's impacting his peer, let's say.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. And I feel like this video in particular hits home some of these behaviors. And it made me think of the like age appropriate piece and kind of like situation specific piece too that we addressed earlier. So these might be age expected behaviors, as you mentioned, for a toddler, but not so much for an adult man.
So how do you have conversations with students at school? Because I mean, I know maybe high schoolers aren't throwing other people's food or spitting out food in that way, but I always laugh a little bit at the version of I'm having a birthday party this weekend, but not inviting you. Because I think that socially, our elementary, middle, and high schoolers often do this in nuanced ways without necessarily intending to. So, how do you have conversations with students to help them understand that, yes, they might be managing or doing something in the moment, but kind of having that perspective taking ability to understand how it impacts others? Like, what are ways you can help students kind of see that in a non judgmental attempt?
I will use a lot of reflective language in speaking with students. So, kind of like thinking about the impact that what they said or what they did had. So, kind of reflecting on like, so if you did this or when you did this, kind of like leading to if when situations and talking about what happened next. I often find that the intention is good, but the delivery doesn't always land. And as you were talking about, it made me think of this situation has popped up quite recently and navigating that piece. And I think often having that perspective of how it makes folks in the out group feel. A lot of our students are inherently empathetic and may not have considered that in the moment. It feels really good to be a part of an in group. And for many of our students, they haven't experienced that before. So they aren't having that lens in the moment.
So, what about for families at home who have students who either tend to be very socially aware, but maybe they're having a glitch of some sort with a peer who is less socially aware? Maybe we'll start with that. I have another question, but we'll start with that one. What can families do to have that conversation of, you might know what's socially expected, but how do we work on maybe these peer interactions you're having with someone else whose social awareness is still developing?
Yeah, again, for me, it speaks to that empathy piece too, and understanding that different people are coming from different ability levels and just like stages of growth and development. And I think in my experience, especially at the high school level, students really do have that perspective and have a lot of empathy for each other. Um, and it is about, I think for me, it would circle back to the self-management and self-awareness piece and working on your own regulation to show how you can show up for others in that moment. It is really hard to maintain your own regulation in a situation that's unexpected. So I think there's this piece of like monitoring how that student or that child is showing up is really important.
I wish we could have a follow-up video of, the time the other gentleman freaks out at this
Yes.
response, right?
Yes.
You can only keep your cool for so long. So you were talking before about working with students and utilizing reflective listening and kind of asking questions to help students reflect on their own experiences. How might families utilize that at home in a way that doesn't feel like therapeutic? Maybe to talk about a situation. I know students all the time are confiding in their families about something that has hurt them or bothered them in terms of a social interaction. How can families help build that social awareness or that perspective taking at home in a way that is non-judgmental? At times I think it's so hard, or also in a way to encourage their resilience. Like, I want to fix it sometimes as a mom, and I know I'm not supposed to. So, like, what are ways families can engage in those conversations?
I think that coming at it from your own empathetic lens is really helpful in your own regulated space. Something Laura and I have talked about often is that you can't teach regulation without modeling regulation. So it's a good opportunity to practice our own skills and show up for our kids. I think a piece too of like encouraging reflection, which can be really challenging for many adolescents and arguably many people. I feel like with my own 6-year-old, so not an adolescent, but kind of saying, like, I hear you saying this actually happened today. I hear you saying that so and so did this thing, and then explaining like the aftermath of it, and talking through like how could that person have felt in that moment? What could we do differently? And kind of utilizing that language isn't shame-based, but just more productive in how we can manage our own behavior next time. Because I feel like there's always opportunity to go back and repair.
And it sounds like you're saying be in a regulated, well, have your child be in a, or your adolescent be in a regulated place before you kind of do that problem solving conversation.
Absolutely.
Just feels like no deep processing happens when we're heightened in our feelings, right?
I am definitely not the person who's able to process deeper level feelings in those moments.
I know for our students, and there's a whole nother webinar on this, but the nuances of social awareness can be really tricky with the dyslexic or LBLD profile. Can you chat just briefly a little bit about maybe holes or kind of misses that students might have every now and again in terms of their ability to perceive other social intentions or interactions?
Definitely. I think we have a great program at the high school called the Expressive Language Department, and they focus a lot on that skill development piece, especially about social engagement. Um, I think the way our students perceive situations may not always reflect reality. So I do a lot of like reality-based testing sometimes with students, and I think there's a piece too of it may be difficult for some of our students at Landmark to read body language and eye contact or demonstrate those skills on their own. So that can kind of play like a funky role in engaging with your peers, and can be misread easily. So we will do kind of like an analysis sometimes of the social engagement and kind of have kids, as much as I hate role playing, I will have students role play social situations to kind of see in live action, kind of like play it out with them. I think often it takes the pressure off because it's not a same age peer. It's a trusted adult kind of working through it. And I've had a lot of success with that.
And you use the term reality testing. What's that mean?
The one that comes to mind often is I hear from students like, so and so yelled at me.
Mm.
And sometimes I will ask, would I think that so and so was yelling? And I think there's a feeling of their perception and is impacted by the level of intensity of their feelings. So their lens might be that they are, because they're anxious and overwhelmed by a situation, they're going to perceive things negatively. Or anxiously driven individuals will perceive it through a different lens than it was intended. And kind of like working through that piece with students is something that I've, again, have found great success with.
Yeah, building that perspective taking, it sounds like. We
Absolutely.
definitely have the students saying, either got in trouble from a teacher or from my parents, and it turns out they had a conversation, and like that can feel like trouble, right? You had to sit and have a serious conversation. It wasn't fun.
Yep.
So, all right. So moving on to kind of relationship skills. I know these tend to bleed together a little bit, but as we have students who build their self-awareness and their management, they're kind of understanding that social awareness. How does that then lead or impact kind of the relationship skills piece?
It's a great question. Relationship skills, so that involves the ability to establish and maintain healthy relationships with different people and groups. Categories and things to consider include the in and out groups, again, neurodiversity and ableism, Relationship skills are influenced by the mastery or lack of mastery of other SEL competencies. They help students communicate clearly, listen and respond appropriately, cooperate with peers, resolve conflicts, and ask for help and set boundaries. Some of these feel like really big topics. And these skills are essential for friendships, classroom participation, teamwork, at-home dynamics, and eventually a workplace success.
So it sounds like, again, even though these skills aren't necessarily linear, as we develop more social awareness, then we can apply that to the relationships that we have and kind of strengthen those relationships or the skills we have to know kind of how to act in different relationships, like how the relationship might be different between you and your teacher versus you and a peer. Kind of needs to happen there.
Yep.
So I know that we see, obviously, because we work with kids and adolescents, lots of ways that relationship skills can be challenging. So maybe we can talk through a few of those.
Yeah. So what you might see in someone who's struggling with relationship skills is clinging. So that person that is, it kind of ties into our, I don't know if it'll pop up for the next one, I apologize. Kind of this like clinging onto a relationship, kind of the fear of losing out on a friend or missing out, that kind of that FOMO. And then someone with stronger relationship skills demonstrates understanding of flexibility in friendships.
I feel like sometimes we see this more with the dyslexic profile, just that kind of hyper focus or rigidity around like I have my person or I need to be close by and I'm not sure how to insert myself into the group. So I'm just kind of lingering there versus understanding when I should be like in the conversation versus maybe somewhere else.
Yeah. A person struggling with the relationship skills might hyper focus on that one friend. For me, it kind of builds on clinging. And someone with stronger and more enhanced relationship skills might better understand the concept of sharing friends, that just because your friend has other friends doesn't mean you're losing out. And kind of like it's almost like spreading the wealth a little bit socially.
But that piece takes so much self-management, for an adolescent or a middle schooler or even elementary schooler to be strong enough for self-managed, regulated enough to not worry, especially if they've had trouble with friendships or losing friends in the past. Your friend goes to be with someone else. It feels like a normal response to panic.
Yes. So an individual struggling with relationship skills can also demonstrate poor boundaries. That can involve physical boundaries. It can involve like emotional boundaries. You can have the kid who is physically clingy and touchy and not realizing that that's not socially appropriate or acceptable at that time. And then someone with more enhanced relationship skills is more equipped to assert oneself and then listen to other people and take others' perspectives and filter them in and out.
So it seems like as skills develop, obviously we move towards this more like pro-social area, but that depending on your level of management or situation you're dealing with, people are going to kind of flow back and forth, right? Like I imagine we have students who have really great boundaries with their family or their teachers and then are having this issue with like hyper focus on one friend. Like it sounds it's not black and white, I suppose.
Definitely not. And then another one that we've talked a little bit about that ties into the social awareness piece is misreading social cues. This can be, again, that can fall into the eye contact or lack of physical proximity. I think social cues, one that always makes me feel a little nutty is the wild world of Snapchat and misreading and misunderstanding dynamics in the social media world. And then other folks with more enhanced relationship skills are more equipped to read the room and can navigate those different social settings with different folks.
Feels like the relationship skills in general, like doing them in person is one thing, but it's a whole nother ball game in the virtual social media world.
I do not envy where our students are at this point. It is really a wild world.
Do you see with high schoolers like examples of clinging or poor boundaries? Like what does that look like over social media, like on Snap or something like that?
This actually played out last week where we had some folks who were preparing for an event and had a Snapchat group chat, and then two students realized that they had been unintentionally left out of the group chat, and I will give credit where it's due. I feel like the group of students really managed it well and like talked it out. But I think the perception that they were being left out intentionally was internalized and then kind of came out really hot, and was diffused by a student who has some really solid relationship skills.
So, what advice would you give families? They have a student at home who's getting either being left out or has someone who's maybe too clingy on the other end, sending constant texts, or maybe you're helping to monitor your adolescent's phone and you realize maybe they're misperceiving something or someone else's. What sort of guidance would you give parents to help them support students without kind of entirely taking over? Because we know that's the last thing our adolescents want.
It's the last thing they want, and I feel like it's our first impulse. I think a discussion about qualities of healthy relationships is a really good foundation for any of these skills that we're talking about. We have to understand that some behaviors are unhealthy in order to advocate to change them. So I think talking about qualities of a healthy relationship and as well as like self-advocacy, I feel like especially at the high school, our students are sick of hearing the term self-advocacy, but I think the development that they have around that skill set is really impressive and kind of have trying to think of how to phrase. I lost my train of thought a little bit. I apologize.
It's okay. I'm thinking too that you and I have talked a little bit about how at times trying to have discussions with students when they're more heated at home, upset about something understandably, it's really hard to problem solve in those moments or to offer them a different perspective. And it's okay for them to feel hurt and then to kind of sometimes time just helps. Like I feel like we see that all the time with I feel that way too. Like sometimes something really bothers me and I sleep on it and it's not so intense. And so just the reality of that self-management piece, again, playing into the relationship skills.
Yeah, and I think that piece too, like you mentioned, is recognizing that the feelings are fine. A lot of the behaviors are not, and kind of being able to regulate the feelings in order to engage in a way that's pro-social is really helpful.
Yeah. All right, number 5. This is our last one: responsible decision making. I don't know if it's our most complicated, but it feels really hard. It feels hard for grown-ups too, I feel like.
I would agree. So I appreciate all of you sticking with us because we're 5 in. So responsible decision making is the ability to make caring and constructive judgments about one's behavior and social interactions across varied environments. This can be really challenging for some folks. So it involves navigating expectations of the environment and the ability to change hats appropriately. I think of my own day and the different hats that I have to wear throughout that day, including my mom hat and my counselor hat, social worker, colleague, friend, daughter, sister. It's a lot of hats in one day. And it's harder for some folks to shift, and some might need to be explicitly taught to shift. So kind of like when to shift and how to do that. Like we've mentioned for the other skill sets too, it's an ongoing and evolving process.
So let's think about some decisions that come up for our middle and high schoolers, and really our elementary students too. Hopefully not this middle one, but I really like that you put the picture of the phone away, because I feel like that is something for me that sometimes I need to think about what hat I'm wearing in the moment, or even just pause and be mindful and put away my phone, because maybe I'm doom scrolling, maybe I'm wearing that mom hat and I really need to be present. It's funny because as a counselor, I never ever would pick up my phone during a session, but it's interesting the level of like flexibility we give ourselves in other moments. So yeah, talk us through some things that our students go through in terms of decision making in their day.
Yeah, responsible decision making is helping us learn how to show up in different situations, as we discussed. It involves self-awareness and self-management. So kind of knowing when do we do these things, like putting our phone away. I think that is, in my experience, a skill that we think students and adolescents really struggle with, but I think we struggle with ourselves. And it's essentially social math. This is something Laura and I talked through a little bit earlier. It's about weighing decision making, kind of the pros and cons about different situations. So with substance use, you have different hats in those scenarios. So you have your friend hat, you have your student hat, your athlete hat, the child hat, and kind of navigating like how does it impact those different parts of someone's identity? And that can be a lot to navigate, especially in a high pressure social situation. And then the other piece, the upstander piece, is we talk to kids about how to do the right thing, and that standing up to something is the right thing, but it can be really hard. It's especially hard, I think, for adolescents to kind of do that piece and navigating the different components of your identity and changing those hats in order to be able to make the best judgment in that moment.
It's funny, we see our fifth graders a lot really wanting to stand up and do the right thing, and they start to see different social pressures. So it's social emotional learning is that complex process of like, are you regulated enough to make a responsible decision? Are you taking cues from your social environment that are telling you something different than maybe your family environment is in terms of decision making? Like it's that, like we've seen, it's that kind of connection through all the different pieces all together.
Yes.
So thank you so much. I know we have about 8 minutes left. We're going to open it up to questions now, but as a wrap up, I think the castle image, although again, a lot of visual pieces here really helps us to understand kind of how self-awareness and self-management can be such a foundation throughout our lives for practicing the skills that we have to do all the time at school and in work in terms of social awareness and relationships and decision making. Any other words of wisdom or pearls you would leave us with as we think about kind of the burden of having to teach our kids social emotional learning, when maybe we don't feel equipped to do so?
I think it's a huge first step to even show up to a platform of this kind. It is almost 8 o'clock on snowy, cold Wednesday. And I think learning this information is that skill building opportunity, having that foundation and just an additional lens to look at your child or student or anyone's presentation through that lens is really helpful and supportive.
And it sounds like when we're regulated and curious, then our kiddos have all sorts of opportunities to learn about themselves in social and emotional ways. And that's kind of really all it takes. It doesn't take specific pinpointed conversations, just a general willingness to talk about kind of feelings and how they're thinking.
Definitely.
Thank you so much for being here. So at this point, we're going to open it up to questions. This is a question for you, Christine. How do you build bridges between school and family with the same kind of concepts and words?
I feel like that's a great question. It definitely speaks to the castle framework and the different environments and the impact. I think I'm a more communication is better kind of person. So I think being on the same page about things that you're observing can be really helpful. I know that in the school district that we're in for my 6-year-old, we get weekly SEL updates on kind of the strategies and skills and the focus of the week. And I think tapping into those things and infusing that language into what we're doing at home can be really supportive. So it's that bridging up the gap. And I think just doing the same thing and sharing what you're doing at home and what you're seeing at home. I think I'm always curious. You go from having your child in preschool to having your child in kindergarten and have no idea what's going on. So it's just a really great opportunity to build that rapport and support your child in the same moment.
I found too that almost every school has a set of kind of character expectations they're utilizing. And a lot of times their SEL program flows either very structured or very flexible from that. So even finding out what those values are, here at Landmark, we talk all the time about exploration, character, and empowerment. And we kind of embed a lot of this SEL through there. So using some of those words or whatever your school is using. And typically counselors should be really open to give you resources as well in terms of, what's being done at school.
Mm-hmm.
Another question for you, Christine. This is from someone sounds like a teacher and a parent. As a teacher, I usually keep my emotions out of things because students don't need to take care of my feelings. But when I'm with my child, how honest can I be to say something like, that really hurt my feelings, or I felt really sad when you said that?
I think that it can be a really great learning opportunity for our children to experience us labeling our own feelings. I think that using I statements is a good practice. So I felt blank when you blank can be really helpful. I think it's a good strategy to teach our children as well. It kind of takes ownership in a situation. And again, that piece for me, and it resonates, is the feelings are fine, the behavior is not. But going through those conversations can be a really great teachable moment. And I would push back and say that you're not putting it on your child to manage your feelings. You're labeling your feelings and kind of demonstrating that piece. And that self-awareness piece that we're trying to model for our kids.
Sometimes I think you can even add, like if you have a particularly sensitive child, because some kids really take everything in such a way like, oh no, I made my mom sad. Of, I know you may not have meant to, or I know you may have been upset. And so you weren't thinking about how I was feeling, but it's kind of that forecast bit you were talking about earlier. I feel like forecasting kind of different possible explanations. If you have a kid who heads more towards guilt or shame, because there are kiddos like that for sure. Here's another one. As professionals, how do you communicate this with parents or caregivers? For example, a child who may be struggling with self-management. So how might you communicate kind of the concern over self-management with a family?
I'll defer to Laura for younger folks. I think at the high school it's a little bit different. I think a lot of times I will have those conversations more in depth with the students I'm working with. Maybe not in those terms of self-management, but talking through different skill sets and kind of reflect back on, well, I'm hearing this is how you felt, and I'm hearing that this is how you acted, and kind of teasing it out. And tapping into those opportunities to connect with parents. I think parents have a decent pulse on their kids' experience, either from what you're hearing or what you're seeing. And I think reading into that and kind of experiencing that, processing it with your child is really effective. Um, and I think there's just a piece of it's non-emotional language. That is kind of a piece too of just reflecting back what you're hearing from the child is a really important piece.
I'm thinking of two other points. One, like you said, with the age of the kid, depending on the student, just really involving them in the process of communicating with family. I think sometimes by the time students get to us in counseling, we're looking at things more like anxiety or sadness or fear that kids are experiencing. So it is a self-management issue, and it also just might have passed the threshold of like general self-management into something specific where we're skill building.
Yeah.
I think sometimes families will hear from school administrators or teachers when it's kind of like more first tier self-management, fidgety in their seat. Maybe size of the reaction isn't always matching size of the problem. And typically, I think it's the school's job to communicate that information and share some possible solutions and some resources, kind of so that everyone can be on team student. The other thing I'm thinking about is kind of the difference in understanding developmental stages with kids and how some kids present with larger self-management needs, but they might be in peership with those depending on the class. And so sometimes you don't stick out as much if your peers also need the support in self-management. It kind of like takes everyone down a level in terms of the intensity or the recognizability of the need. So I think, again, we tend to provide an opportunity to partner with families. And we also acknowledge that sometimes what families see at home in terms of regulation is really different than at school. Typically, we see extremely regulated kids who at the end of their day are exhausted and coming home to you all not regulated and not managing themselves. I mean, I am not my best self. I wish I were at 5 p.m. with my family. And I think that's very common. And I'm sure it is incredibly frustrating as a parent to hear like, well, they were so great at school all day. Oh, it must be nice, And so I think just encouraging that conversation so that anyone at school might be able to tap into the why, but also knowing, especially if your student has a learning disability, if they're working really hard in school all day, they're tapped out by the end of the day, and you are just not going to get as regulated or strong of a self-manager at that time. And when you say, Christine, that just evening is harder for all of us to manage, like just in our brains, I have to imagine that self-management is lower in the evening.
Yes, and I think too with social media, they're not done filtering out the social piece. So I think on top of being fatigued and kind of gassed out at the end of their days, they're still filtering through the academic piece with homework and the social piece with engagement with their peers, and it's just a lot.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you all again for your time tonight and your willingness, as Christine said, to show up on a chilly evening. Thank you, Christine, for your expertise and your willingness to collaborate tonight. If you have specific questions, please feel free to reach out to us, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening, and we'll see you at a presentation in the future coming up in just a few weeks.
Thank you
so
all.
much.